BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here with a video about Elizabeth Gaskell's novel North and South, which I read for the month of October with Janelle from All the World's page. We did a buddy read for this one, but I was a bad booktuber. I was a bad buddy reader, and I finished the book early. I was only supposed to read 3 or 4 more chapters, and then it just happened. I had like this much of the book left, and I just read it straight through because it was so good. So you probably shouldn't ask me to do a buddy read with you because I have difficulty constraining myself. But I love the book. It was very good. Definitely going to be reading more Elizabeth Gaskell. This was my very first Elizabeth Gaskell novel. And I'm sitting here thinking about how it's my first and how I should have looked up when it was published originally. So yes, here on the front it says it was first published in a serialized way in Household Words between 1854 and 1855. Then it was published in 2 volumes in 1855, and the first Penguin edition was published in 1995, and this seems to have been reprinted in 2003. So there's that. But on to the plot. So this is a novel about Margaret Hale, who is the less wealthy relative. The novel opens when she has been staying with her cousin and with her aunt. Her cousin has just gotten married, and after the whole wedding and everything, off she goes back to her father's house, back to the parish where he is a minister. And the novel starts off pretty slow. We have this proposal from the brother of her cousin's husband, and although she has thought of him as a good friend, she is just not into him in that way, and she doesn't explain fully why. If she was going after wealth, if she was going after security, this would be an excellent match. But I think this early proposal goes to show us that, 1, she is a desirable woman. She is a woman that people propose to. And 2, she is not going to marry for the sake of marrying. She's a woman with independent thoughts and a mind of her own. And when she marries, it's going to be for love, we would assume. So she rejects this early suitor, and then we launch into the main plot of the novel. And I don't think it was a spoiler to tell you that she rejects him, because relatively speaking in the plot, that's a very minor point in the early part of the novel. In fact, as Janelle and I were reading, she said to me, why was that proposal in there at all? Why was this man in this novel at all? And I think either one, I'm not sure how she wrote this, perhaps that was just how she started off with the novel idea, given that it was a serialized format. If she was the sort of writer who wrote this novel in bits and had it published in bits, that could make sense that he would be irrelevant later on. But if she is the sort of writer who wrote the novel in its complete entirety and then published it in bits, perhaps that early suitor is in there just to sort of set the scene, to let us know that she is a desirable woman and to let us know a little bit about her character. But that aside, he is very unimportant, so to speak. Although he does have that attitude where, oh, she's rejected me, well, I'm still in love with her, I'll have to hope and perhaps try again later. But we quickly leave him behind because we jump into the real plot of the novel. The beginning is almost like a false start. Perhaps that's not even where the story needed to begin. I think Elizabeth Gaskell could just as very well have left out the cousin and the other suitor altogether and started it at Margaret Hale's father's parish in Hampshire, England, where she has grown up where her mother is quite comfortable. Her mother is in relatively good health. She is looking after the poor. She enjoys a respectable position, and all is well until Margaret's father announces to Margaret one day that he has written a letter to the bishop, to the church, and he is quitting. He is quitting his lifelong career as a minister, as a representative of the Church of England, and they are moving to the industrial town of Milton. Now, Milton, from what I understand, is a fictional city that Elizabeth Gaskell made up so that people wouldn't accuse her of writing of, I believe, Manchester was the industrial city that she based it on. People wouldn't accuse her of bad-mouthing Manchester. But it's a little bit funny to me to read about the city of Milton, because there is a place here in Canada, here in Ontario, Milton, Ontario, which is hardly anything like the Milton described here, but of course I've got those associations in my head, and so whenever Milton is mentioned, I am thinking of Milton, Ontario. But so this would have been quite scandalous at the time. It's not something that you would have done. It definitely destroys the social rank that Margaret and her mother are used to. They're left not really understanding where they sit in the world, which I think puts Margaret in an interesting position for when they actually get to Milton. And she finds herself in a different part of England, first of all. And so the social convention, the social mores are a little bit different. Society is a bit different. And because she is sort of out of place, she balances in a really interesting way between what I would call the upper class in the city. There really is no upper class like you would have in London, so to speak, but you have the industrial business owners, you have the mill owners, you have Mr. Thornton, for instance, who is one of the first people that Margaret and her father encounter when they get to Milton. And Mr. Thornton is, he's a young man in his early 30s. I believe that Margaret finds him rather good looking, although she doesn't say so. And he's pretty wealthy. He is self-established. He worked his way up from poverty. He takes care of his mother in style. But his social conventions are different from Margaret's social conventions. For instance, there is this whole back and forth where they keep misunderstanding each other because they don't understand the conventions of society. They both find the other cold. Mr. Thornton, for instance, is offended that Margaret doesn't shake his hand, but where she's from, a lady would not shake a gentleman's hand, even if it is done in Milton. So she's seeing sort of this upper business-owning society, but she is also balanced in an odd way where she has lost her position and she is connecting with some of the working class members of society in Milton. And she struggles with this difficulty of class relations, difficulty of labor relations. She is very, very sympathetic towards the mill workers who aren't really earning enough to keep their families, who want to go on strike. But at the same time, she is also sympathetic to Mr. Thornton, who is, of course, the mill owner. He owns the business, and he is doing his best with the international markets, with other things that are going on, and he is trying to keep his mill running, trying to keep his own position, trying to keep his wealth from vanishing. And so they clash over that. There is one scene that I found rather ridiculous in here. True Victorian melodrama, so to speak. So there is this big riot going on, and Margaret has found herself at the house of Mr. Thornton, where she was visiting Mr. Thornton's mother. And Margaret finds herself, I won't tell you how, but she finds herself out in the crowd, out where this riot is taking place, where the workers who have been out on strike are upset, and one of them tosses a rock. I think it's described as a pebble, and it's described as like grazing her cheek or her forehead or something, and she essentially faints. That's how I read the scene. She faints, and of course Mr. Thornton gathers her up, and there's this big thing, and they're like, oh my goodness, call the doctor. And she comes to, decides that she's fine, and walks off. But it was just, that typical, the Victorian lady who swoons at anything. And so I was actually laughing out loud at that scene. So although some parts of the novel are a little bit on the ridiculous side, it was quite enjoyable, and I enjoyed that tension and romance between Margaret and Mr. Thornton. I enjoyed the intellectual journey that her father was embarking on. He stepped away from his position as a minister from his parish for unclear reasons. I had difficulty understanding whether it was because he no longer believed in God but loved the church, or it was because he believed in God but no longer agreed with the church's interpretation of God and of religion. But either way, he had a crisis of faith and was unable to stay in his position. And we get this image of this man buried in his books, searching and searching, but at the same time, he comes across as a bit of an ass, because this is a time when he was responsible for looking after his wife and daughter. In that society, they weren't doing anything to earn their own living. They had to downsize, they were low on money, and he just decided, he had to give it all up so that he could sit and lock himself away in a study and read his books and think and earn a little bit of income through tutoring. And so, I understand his perspective and think if I were in his position, I would have done the same, but he's stuck in this complex social situation where, because he chose to marry, because he chose to have children, perhaps his life is not really entirely his own, because to abandon his position without even consulting his wife or consulting his daughter is to essentially tear their lives apart without apology. But overall, a very interesting novel, definitely something I would recommend if you're looking to get into some Victorian literature. It's definitely an easy reading style, so to speak. As I said, I breezed right through it, and it wasn't heavy or wordy as some other writers that I love, like Trollope, for instance, is. It was a very straightforward narrative that I think is a good introduction for anyone wanting to get into Victorian literature, but also for anyone just looking for a very delightful and fun Victorian novel. So I'm going to leave it there. I've been working my way through an audiobook on Victorian Britain, so I'm going to finish that. And I think I may begin Mary Barton, which will be my last read of Victober. So I will see you on Friday, I guess, with my Friday reads. I'll be back at that after being absent from that for 2 weeks. The rest of my evening now, it's actually election night here in Canada. I went and voted in the federal election after work, and it's almost 6 o'clock here, so I'm going to tune in online to the CBC's election coverage. I was joking with my friend earlier, it's quite tragic and sad because this is my very first election in my life that I've paid attention to election coverage rather. My very first election without Peter Mansbridge. Peter Mansbridge was the CBC news anchor for years and years, and all the election coverage I've ever watched has essentially been him. But of course he's retired now, and so the joint news anchors, I guess, are going to be doing the election coverage, so that should be fairly interesting. I'll make a cup of tea, settle down with a book, and keep that on in the background. Have a lovely evening.